their Disguidance segment with the 2MK team. Today we are showing off our Orobot as soon as we confirm the sound check on this particular thing. This is a test based on our newest headset, so hopefully everything's fine on that front. Seems like it is, so we can begin. If you aren't terribly familiar with how our bots work, and particularly how our Disguidance streams work, we'll be starting off with a basic explanation of why the bot is designed the way it is, which moves and similar we considered important to put into it, and a comparison to the CPU version, so you can figure out whether or not the CPU can teach you anything. Sometimes we suggest that you play the CPU alongside the bot, so you get both sides of it, and sometimes we figure that the CPU is basically useless, at least for where we're aiming. And when I say where we're aiming, I mean that most of our content is geared toward those below gold, particularly in the bronze to silver range. Absolute beginners can get something out of it, but for the two newest characters, this is a lot less likely. So, moving forward from there, we are looking for whether or not Oro has any tricky mix-ups or heavy pressure. The answer is no, basically. He can't just pummel you with buttons mid-screen and you'll be able to do nothing. But we've definitely put in a lot of options into the bot where he has things that can lead to this. They're sort of reactable, but not necessarily something that you would always expect other players to do, partially because of this. Still, we made sure they're in there. We'll be going through multiple characters, technically moving after the Abigail you're seeing, from those who are zoners, but we're not starting with any conventional zoners, all the way to close range fighters who are always in Oro's face, or at least whenever they can afford to be. This bot works well with both the V skills and both V triggers, so we'll be showing that off as well. And the precise aspect of the stream is that you're going to see this, get the explanation, and then get an explanation of the inputs required to make it do this, with a bit more nuance than you can find on our Twitter, 2_MK_FGC. There wasn't any need to make any changes from the prototype. I had a lot of time to think through how to do this correctly, and overall they all worked out. But they're a little trickier to input than you can get across easily in tweets, and it often helps if there's some visual aids. When facing this bot, you should set the bot itself to have maximum start on its V meter and maximum start on its CA gauge. Since the player is practicing mostly punishes for this bot and training their own understanding of meter watching, it would have made sense to make you have higher meters on your own side, so the player gets normal for both. After all, you're training with an old master here. You're trying to get the most out of it you possibly can. On that note, Oro is functionally an advanced bot. One could argue that he's slightly less for certain different characters, and that will also come up, since the characters themselves do affect one part of the point system, as we refer to it. In fact, let's go right into that now. Point system for the bot. The easiest point, the one that goes in first and that you stop counting when you go up to medium difficulty, is to punish that kick you're seeing. The move is quite negative. It is -10 basically all the time. It can be -16 if he somehow only manages to hit you with the first hit of it, so if you were spaced really far out and only got hit by the first hit, and the knockback caused you to be further away, you can use even longer moves. This isn't necessarily a move you expect to see a lot in neutral, but Oro does use it as a good shield and can confirm into it fairly often for a good benefit. If you're not familiar already, it can actually be kind of hard to punish because he can be just outside of the range of your best punishes in terms of their startups, and this can make it kind of difficult to get max damage. So think of it more so as learning how to optimize all of your punishes so that whenever you see that move, you've managed to convince the Oro player that they are in danger and shouldn't do it, or that they keep on doing it and then they lose. The second point system is simple. Just deal with the fact that Oro occasionally jumps. It does not really matter how you do this, and technically you can give yourself a point depending on how he does the Jinshu Atari, his hopping crane style down kick. Whether or not he does that move consistently and in what way is going to depend on one of the inputs, so we'll get back to that later. The next point is punishing his uppercut, as he's just decided to demonstrate for us. This move is relatively hard to punish properly if you're not ready for it. Things to do with ranges. He's just one of those characters where you're likely to miss the uppercut punish if you aren't quite practiced at the game, or just because it's unfamiliar for Oro, he doesn't necessarily end up all that close to you, even when you block it sometimes. And he goes quite high in the air, so similar to Ken, you have to wait a relatively long time before you start your punish, and it can cause some distress or difficulty. The last point system changes according to what type of character you're playing, and since the character type you're playing is supposed to change which V skill and V trigger you choose for Oro to use, it's often connected to that in some way. It's very important to be able to deal with Oro's V system options because he's really strong with them. And if you aren't able to do this, you're probably just out of luck. This of course means that as it gets up in bot difficulty, as we say, you're still trying to do all those things, but you no longer get points for just anti-airing or dealing with the kick. He does the uppercut rarely enough that you still always get points for punishing that. But now that you understand why the bot is built the way it is, let's take a look at what the CPU Oro chooses to do. And as always, Abigail is our optimal character to be doing that with. We'll put it at 7 as always. And we won't bother changing any of the settings at this point. The CPU Oro will use more moves that the bot doesn't have. We didn't literally put in every move into the bot. There are quite a few things that Oro can do with footsies that are going to be problematic. But because of the way the character is designed to generally punish well, do cool things, and stuff like that, where the damage is the main thing you're dealing with, the bot itself isn't always going to be looking for the optimal way to play. Most players, when given a character like this to use, end up kind of overwhelmed by all the options they're given, and therefore don't necessarily use them all. So you don't in fact see a whole lot of Oro's footsie buttons in the bot at this time. He will definitely use his crouching medium kick. Depending on the inputs, he'll use his crouch medium punch. Usually if you've not put him in absolutely perfectly, that phase will be sweep, but that's fine too. His sweep is quite good and technically only -8, which means that that's his own challenge. We are, as usual, in a dark-ish stage background so that I can most easily demonstrate the actual inputs before we move into talking about the extra point system and the different characters and what they do.
Perfect KO.
Alright then, let's talk inputs. Oro's inputs are frustrating, but not difficult to understand. They're frustrating to input in various ways. You have to use lots of tricks for them. So, let's look at the easiest first, Action 1. For this you will probably want to set a shoulder button, or whichever button is easiest to hold on your hitbox or arcade stick. Easiest to hold down while still hitting the options button to end the recording. Probably with the same hand. Because this input is a standing heavy punch which you hold all the way to the end, including when you press the options button, followed by a down back, press throw. In this case you can see the throw is plinked slightly, that's perfectly fine. Just make sure that it is a throw. And then a crouch medium kick. In general, you want to hold this a little bit longer than you otherwise would. You're not just hitting the medium kick and immediately ending the recording. He needs a little bit of time. Probably around the same amount of time you would do if you were doing a crouch medium kick into some move on your own character, presuming your character has anything like that. So just long enough, because this will help him build up enough charge to do some of his other options. If you are not aware, Oro is in fact a charged character. The second is a little bit harder, and I'll demonstrate something else. You can use this setting to set just the 2 punches required to 1 button. But this one doesn't actually involve holding the button. Specifically, it involves holding the button for only a very short time and explicitly letting go, which can be a little hard to get used to because many of us are used to just tapping it. This input is a forward medium punch plus light punch, and it requires that it be on the first frame. In order to do that, you can do some other things, but the fact that it is usually supposed to be first frame isn't actually required, so you don't usually have to go through all of the extra bits that we will show later. The important thing is that there is a forward light punch plus medium punch followed by an up forward, and then at least 3 taps of forward again for dashes. Whether or not you put in 4, just try not to overdo it, because then he will dash too many times, mainly because the input will become too long. In terms of releasing the button, it's important to try to release it at the moment where you have reached the up forward. So you can hold forward, tap the button, switch quickly to up forward and release it, then lift everything up and start tapping a couple times for the dash. The purpose of this input is a little bit hard to explain because it's mainly that you can use it to get negative edge uppercut. And it's kind of nice when he has that move. You can also see here that it is a way to get the upward projectile, but that upward projectile isn't actually happening because of the medium punch at all. In fact, it's happening because of the release of the heavy punch. So technically you could test that on its own, but it usually wouldn't play out that way. Once you've got these two recording though, you should be able to see that happen. If I pull Oro a bit, different things will happen. but nothing too complicated. It's literally just minor things happening. This is particularly good because when he's on his own, he tends to do the projectile that way, and if you mess with him a little bit or change his rhythm in some way, he'll do things like the uppercut, or sometimes the EX version of the projectile. His next input is fairly easy to understand as well. This one, unlike many, doesn't start with a button. You just do a quarter circle back with the medium kick, and then hold down back again and tap the medium kick again. It's very difficult to explain the timing for this. In general, your aim is to turn out a certain way. It takes about a second total, and he should never generally just do the crouch medium kick. The crouch medium kick will be hidden in the full animation of this unless he hits you. And that is basically the perfect timing. This is obviously to give him access to that move. But we didn't want to overcomplicate anything with the rest of it. You can try to put another button at the beginning of this if you really want to. But just a quick quarter circle back, hold down back, press medium kick is enough. And you are not trying to hold the down back long enough to get a charge from this input, so you don't care. You generally can and probably should hold the medium kick. Technically, you can also hold the medium kick in action 1. But since neither of these is able to show you that, it becomes more difficult to use it certain ways. But all of those parts of it will be explained on the bot page. For the next input, there's a bit more difficulty, because this one is really precise. And this is why it is in slot 4, because slot 4 is the slot we normally tell you not to mess with. This input requires that you plink something, and it requires that you plink it and then hold it and then release the other button, making it quite complicated, especially because most people put these things on their shoulder buttons. The goal here is to plink a V trigger input and hold it until the end. You're plinking it into a V skill input. All of this is done while holding back. And for this, you will often need some extra help. When I say extra help, I mean the fact that you can set this interval setting to 1, and if you do that and hold back on the stick after you've tried to start the recording, it will not actually do anything. It will give you 1 second where you're just holding back and nothing is happening, and make sure that when you press the button, the first button, it will be entered as back plus that button with no delay whatsoever. We strongly recommend this for this bot because first frame plinking is hard. If you are unable to plink this input, the bot is not useless. It does most of the things you need it to do, but it will lose so much of its capacity in terms of its V skill that you may not be able to get the most out of it. Since Aurora has 3 different uses of V skill in V skill 1, we only needed 2 of them, but having only 1 of them may not be turning out great for you. So, once again, back, plink a V trigger input into a V skill input. You must hold the V trigger input, making this quite difficult, and then a half a circle back input, and then just end the recording instantly. As you can see, this plays out pretty obviously. It continues to cause him to do the kick even more, but generally he'll do the V skill. And depending on the timing of this, he'll do the V skill into that kick that he does out of it. That's generally what you want to see happen. But it also helps if he can do the V skill and not do anything. And that usually means you input the thing absolutely perfectly. He's so quick at it that if he does the V skill hop, nothing changes. It is for this reason we also suggest trying to input Orobot with the V skill set to V skill 2 so that you can see all of these little nuanced details. The final input also matters whether or not you plink it, and we may change this later on in the stream to demonstrate how it works when you don't. In this case, we are plinking a V skill input and a heavy kick. And again, which of these you hold and in which ways relies a lot on whether or not you want specific things out of the bot. But as you've seen it here, you want to plink the V skill input and the heavy kick with the V skill input first while holding down back, and then just do a quarter circle forward and end it. You can tell that the V skill input was not held because if it were held, you would not see the V skill input anymore. That's generally how you can tell with those. You would just see a continual crouch heavy kick, which is what happens with action 1. We press the heavy punch, but because we held it the entire time, you just stop seeing it. There is no more heavy punch. As long as it is replaying into itself, the heavy punch is considered to be held indefinitely, so you never see it. So that's a way to notice whether or not certain things have happened. But in this case, we don't care. And it's fine that he will do this basically every time. If you don't plink this, unlike the other one, it still works fine. Plinking offers some benefits in that he will use his crouch medium punch at times instead of using sweep, but he doesn't actually do either of these things so often, usually, that the bot is likely to be ruined by any shifts on that end. But now we are moving on to the actual explanation of how to make the most of your Orobot based on which types of characters you play. Good luck with the inputs because they are not simple, and the behavior of the bot does not change too much, but it is meaningful. However, if you're really interested, you can obviously watch basically the entire rest of the stream and see what sort of behaviors the bot can get up to. You may need to watch for it actually that long because Orobot does a lot of things. The character is very versatile, and the bot does a very large amount of the things that he's capable of. So let's start by looking at whether or not you are a zoner or you are a close-up player. If you're playing a zoner, a standard one, you should train for whatever suits you. But a non-standard zoning character, let's change some V skills and V triggers on Oro's side to get the maximum of that. If you're trying to zone Oro, then you generally want him to have the Tengu Stone and his Onibi. So his V skill should be 1, his V trigger should be 2. And you can immediately see why. The V skill is something that you can punish, but most zoners can't actually do anything about this. Time for a button change for our demo player. Depending on your projectile invincibility options, which is something that unconventional zoners often have, even if it's just getting them out of the way of the incoming projectile. But Oro is even more strange than that, which means that some of your options don't even work. You can see that if you've input things correctly, you actually will get Oro's double jump. This is reliant on action 2's input, so if you don't see it ever, then maybe that's different. But most importantly, if you are playing from far away like this, you need to be able to use your methods for either hitting him before he does something, or countering his V skill in some way. At the moment he doesn't seem too happy to be using it, so we'll just wait on that for a bit, more or less. And I'll happily explain Tengu Stone instead. Basically, we made sure to provide Oro with that version, which you've just seen, that bounces up once, which does block Poison's swing to some extent, and this lower version, which she can go over. But you don't have an easy way of figuring out which one of these things is happening until it's like too late, so bear that in mind. There are no point systems based around that precise move for most characters. But characters who definitely have not only a way around it, but a way to do damage when they go around it. Will have a point for this. In fact, let's switch Poison's V skill in order to demonstrate that. We now have a roll which can go under the high bounce one. But as you can see, there's not an easy enough way to know which of them it is. Now you can of course just jump over the projectile. If you're fairly far out as a zoner, zoners tend to have long, as we call them, zoning jumps. A really deep, long range jumping heavy kick, and this is in fact also a point. Because it's actually worth doing quite a lot of the time. He takes quite long to do this move, and most of the time, even if he is looking to uppercut you or something after it, you can land and fake him out instead of actually jumping in a way that will matter to the attack. As demonstrated there, he also has his EX projectile, which will home in on you but can't seem to go backward, which means if you jump over that correctly at the last moment, you're also away from that one. And there you see spacing, where the uppercut does happen, but it doesn't really affect him. You can go ahead and give yourself the point if you were in fact so close that you ended up crossing Oro up. It's up to you to decide whether or not this is likely, because Oro using this move very close to you isn't necessarily something that isn't going to happen. Some players just have enough of a plan, or enough guts, let's say, to try to do this. So let's shift our demo player's goal, like overall goal, to actually just hitting Oro from long range. Because technically Poison doesn't want to get in here. Poison kind of has to some extent. And this is where the Tengu Stone comes in. Once the Tengu Stone is active, Oro has more options, and you definitely want to keep him out. But he'll use the ball to cover his approach, or just confuse you into thinking he wants to approach at that time. Depending on your character, you might want to change the meter to auto recover, but we generally don't recommend it. So much of this bot is about getting your punishes down and your anti-airs that you tend to build up Oro's meter fairly quickly anyway. He often will activate the V trigger in neutral, but won't necessarily overdo it so much that you have to care, which means you can go ahead and use the V trigger meter at auto recover, and he won't necessarily just constantly spam it, but it is definitely going to be a lot more than you're seeing here. So you can decide how you feel about that. and how you want to do your testing. Especially because once Oro has activated Tengu Stone, you don't actually do much. You're mostly supposed to defend. And which normals Oro hits have the biggest effect on this. This is partially why it's good if you can get him to have the crouch medium punch, because it will send the Tengu Stones out further than the crouch medium kick does, and to some extent further than the sweep will. He does have quite a few combos that come up as a result of this, and of course he's helped immensely by the fact that once all of this is going on, you're less likely to tech the throw. We'll offer lots of variants as to how to make the bot behave differently to your specifications. Most of them will not make the bot particularly harder to input. So if you tend to have a main character and you want to work mainly to pick up your skills against this character with your main, you should be able to tailor the bot to your main and not worry about it too much. Unlike many where your playstyle matters more than the character you're playing, this isn't really true for this character. He has so many options that he's likely to force you to do things based on what exactly your character is like. The Tengu Stone also has some other weird behaviors. Specifically that the amount of time it takes for that meter to go down depends on what objects exactly Oro has called. And therefore it is at least partially luck. There are some other effects like freezing you and so on, but in general, if you see either plastic dinosaurs or Blanca doll, assume that the V-trigger is going to last longer than it normally does. It doesn't generally do much more damage. It might do more stun in the case of the Blanca doll. But that's about all you need to know in that regard. Interrupting Oro at close range when he does that move incorrectly, basically when he shouldn't, is not really a point, nor is it specifically a good idea all of the time. But if you don't think your opponent is setting you up, either they hit it by accident or they misjudged the range somehow, absolutely go ahead and hit it. You have a lot of time. You probably have almost enough time to just jump over him on reaction and do cross-up things. Which is why we mentioned earlier, it's up to you if you give yourself a point for this. You're really more so looking at, can you react in time to it happening? But again, the idea is that you're playing characters who, for whatever reason, fight fairly far away from Oro, and would give a player good enough reason to think, I should use this V skill. But what about if your character can just go straight with projectile invincibility? In fact, what if your character has complete projectile invincibility for some period of time moving forward? Characters like Ken or Ryu don't quite have this going for them, because they at least will have difficulty with projectiles that have too much of an arc, so Oro still has some things he can do there. We're talking characters who just go straight through them. And for now, we'll change stage because we probably no longer need to be showing off that aspect of it. So we're still dealing with the Onibi and the Tengu Stone. Oro has no specific reason not to use this against Colleen, because she can't parry projectiles, and therefore it helps to have better setups this way. So at least for me, as a Colleen player, I'm going to train against this. If you are a close-up pressure style Colleen player, then sure, go ahead and use the other V skill, and we'll get into talking about why that is and what that does later. While Colleen does have full projectile invincibility while doing the light version of her backstep, she will sometimes have issues because the duration of that invincibility isn't necessarily enough to get through all of Goro's slower projectile setups. Fortunately for her, she could just block her way through a lot of this. You generally don't want to block though, because every time that projectile hits you, Oro is building up meter again, and you generally want to minimize this. Overall, the plan is the same. When you see the move, go through it. And because of the way she interacts with things, and other characters like her interact with things, this is more important when the Tengu Stone is active. Because Oro can put a lot of attacks in front of these characters, and they're not necessarily good at going straight through those, partially because they've been given the ability to go straight through other things. So he benefits a lot more from playing some fuzzy stuff in the mid-range, not necessarily blocking for too long, and protecting himself with the Tengu Stone in this way, as you've just seen. So if I get this wrong, you just get hit, which makes it somewhat worth practicing. But this is not to say that just going, well, I'm going to go through this every time in a match is a good idea. It's just a useful option to have available to you, and therefore something you might want to work on. If you can stall him for long, that also helps with the Tengu Stone, because the timer runs down whether or not he's actually doing anything. Okay, let's bring him about that far and wait for the next Onibi ball. Again, with the idea that once you block it, there's a certain amount of gain Oro gets that you might want to avoid him getting. Fortunately that for me, that one sailed right over my head. No benefit to Oro at all. As you can see, he doesn't just spam this move either. The more you interrupt him, the more likely he is to do something. But he's definitely capable of dashing twice, and similar. So getting hit by that is like half of a meter. Blocking it is really not much. But it's not nothing, and because he will probably get so many chances to use it, you have to care. That was effectively the perfect execution of that. And characters like her often have similar options. We'll discuss some stuff that Cammy does later. We were going to give points initially for attacking his throw, but it didn't seem to actually be a good idea in the end. He does not necessarily throw at a predictable time, but while we often have bots that give you the point for attacking the throw precisely because of that, Oro just doesn't seem to suit it as much. That heavy punch, which he's just chosen to demonstrate, is chargeable, and the version that we're using here is charged because we hold the button. This is important to know because that move is actually advantaged when charged, and you therefore care about whether or not he presses anything after. In general, because of the timings of various things, he will press something after it, usually a crouch medium kick, and therefore you, if you got everything perfectly right, are subjected to, let's call it, real oral pressure. The EX version of the kick is even less safe, leading to basically Oro should never use this except as a combo confirm, but it's still in there because if it is less safe, and you know it's less safe, it would help if you knew how to get even more damage. You do in fact still get the point for punishing the EX version, you just have to know what you're doing. So as you can see, when he does this move and you block it, it's not even quite a quarter of a bar. I guess it might be. There's the double jump trickery. You should not give yourself any points for whiff punishing the kick, but it's still a good thing to work on. It helps sometimes if your character has good reach. And if you get really good at it, you can do it quickly enough that he has basically no chance to get away from you when you do it. Same actually goes for the standing heavy punch, which can be useful because he has many reasons why he might want to charge that while you're walking in. That was of course not a whiff punish of it, but you can absolutely do it with any character who can reach far enough. He extends his hurt box fairly far, and therefore you can use it in that way. But I was still supposed to be demonstrating Colleen more so as a zoner. Understanding how much time you have to do certain things against Oro for characters like Colleen who have strange projectile timing also matters. Dalsim doesn't count because Dalsim can reach Oro from so far away that it's probably not relevant. But slow projectile characters, or characters who use their projectiles in a slow mode on purpose, such as Nash, tend to need some idea of how much time they have for things. Counter-zoning Oro might in fact be a reasonably good strategy in this matchup, simply because while he does move around quite sprightly for his age, he isn't necessarily a character that poses a lot of threat when doing so. And if you can keep him locked down for longer, especially when he has the Tengu Stone up, you're basically saving yourself from taking lots of damage. But of course, not every character has this out-of-the-way style projectile. There are characters who have very slow projectiles and uses for projectiles that are not out of the way at all. And so we'll move to that demonstration next. When your character has no way around the projectile, you do have to think a little bit differently about it.
Underground Arena. Forgotten Waterfall. Sakura. Oro.
So we are still on the Onibi Tengu Stone, and Sakura can play a lot closer, which will come up just as Colleen can play a lot closer. If you are for some reason a Sakura who is constantly close up, then you care a lot more about something else we will discuss later. But for now, we're still dealing with the I'm sort of a zoner, so I'm throwing projectiles at you. But as you can see, even when Sakura charges her projectiles, she's not necessarily going to deal with Aura all that well, and because of the precise art of the Onibi, it's not necessarily easy to do whatever she wants to do with something like her Tatsus. She's another character that has options but tends to come at you head on. So she does have quite a few good reasons to actually use her projectiles in this matchup. But in order to do this, you're in that situation where you kinda have to get Oro to not want to use the ball. So you end up doing it at the mid-range where you don't have a lot of time to charge it. In the case of this type of character, we considered making it so that just hitting with the projectile at all is point. But obviously that doesn't work too well. He doesn't not get hit because he kicks them or something. Nor does the projectile go through the Onibi, so you really don't have any options there either. But it's for these characters where you care the most about attacking the throw, and most importantly, when he does the sweep, punishing the sweep. Because what you want at this point is to get control of the situation as much as possible. If you find that that isn't really your style, then probably he needs to be on a different skill in the first place. But for now, just for a little bit, we're going to leave it this way. Because another large part of the gameplay of zoning characters like these is the fact that they get locked down when the ball is placed. And certain ones like Sakura don't actually have quite as good a zoning jump or number of useful air options. Colleen does have these, or can just go through it, but since Sakura doesn't have this, the point is more so for dealing with the Onibi itself. And when I say dealing with, I don't necessarily mean trying to go through it, but to defend yourself and still get what you wanted out of the situation, probably after having blocked it or tried to avoid it, but your avoidance isn't just a move you do to solve the problem. Especially because you don't really want to use too much meter of any kind in order to deal with this. If you find this to be too easy, your best bet is probably to set it so that you wait for the move to get close to you and then use your V shift. This may lead to nothing. It may lead to Oro faking you out and blocking it and you still getting hit with the Onibi, but it's not useless to do. And therefore, if you're finding it too easy to count points for every time you block it and defend yourself correctly with your particular character, then yeah, take that as the point system for it instead. But overall, we generally trust that most people will take enough damage from this to be a problem. If not though, and if you find you're a defensive player, the other thing you can do is to change the V trigger, which we will do now. If you change Oro's V trigger, he gains a command grab. And generally, this only matters if you play close up. He has a version of this move that is a hit grab, but it's much more useful to have it as a straight up actual command grab because you can't block it anymore. He can also use it in the air for various reasons, but he uses it up fairly quickly. So another case where you might have good reason to give him auto recovery V-meter. We're not going to do that now, but if you find that you're the sort of person who generally has a projectile character but doesn't use them much and tends to play close up, or definitely doesn't have any negative reaction to the opponent pressuring you and getting close up, you might want to switch for that reason, while still leaving him with the Onibi explicitly. Other characters, as we go forward, are going to shift from this and use the V-Skill 2 instead. But in this case, it can definitely still be useful to you. Especially if you're not great at hit confirms, because the bot does block a non-trivial amount of time compared to others. And you can find yourself in some weird situations. But honestly, most of the time, he's just going to whiff this in neutral to no benefit whatsoever. So, if you find that happens too much, consider what you really want to do there. He's not necessarily going to get all that close, and even when he's not using it, it goes down relatively fast for this sort of V trigger. In this case, you see, for example, he basically let the whole thing run out without ever using it, and you'd know because it wears out really fast. When he does, it takes about half of the bar. He's decided to demonstrate the fact that we managed to get the super in there. And that is the reason why we didn't give him auto-regenerating CA gauge, but he honestly doesn't really need it because he doesn't use his EX moves in the same way as most other characters, so it's fine. One of those things you're going to have to watch out for quite a lot is quite simply that when he does have control of the situation and puts out the ball, you're down and have to defend yourself anyway. This is also the other one where you might want to give yourself the point for attacking the throw as the hardest thing. Overall, these very middle-of-the-road characters who still have the projectile but also don't have any equivalent of a complex air move or dive kick. For example, Ryu counts, but Ken does not because Ken has the Atatsu, which in the air, which is a dive kick, and Akuma has any number of things. So it's actually only a small portion of the cast where you are going the skill 1, the trigger 1, and actually expecting this to teach you much. This will probably be on the bot page as well for suggestions of which characters this applies to, or we might miss a couple, or might just not apply to your fighting style. But of course that raises the question of what about those characters who do have these things? Particularly characters who don't much use their projectile, or at least players who have characters who have a projectile and explicitly don't use it, such as myself. If your preferred style is just straight footsies and therefore the chances of you ever getting a good zoning game going with your projectile, by choice or otherwise, is low, then it's at that point where you have to start thinking about having the skill 2 as Oro's main option. So we're on to Chun-Li for a bit. Oro's V skill 2 is about mix-ups. It's actually a slow enough move that you could just react to it, but with enough other things happening, that can be hard. Fortunately for you, they've decided to balance the character so that it can never be too hard. Namely, he gives up the pressury, confusing skill that you've been seeing in order to get the new one.
High roller casino. Chun-Li. Oro.
At this point, it starts to matter a lot less which of these two you use. But if you are, again, playing footsies, you probably want to stick with the Tengu Stone. In general, you can just assume that if you are playing a footsies character, particularly one who has any difficulty defending their legs, or, in Chun-Li's case, might be charging too often and might get hit by an overhead that you have to be ready for, then 2-2 is probably what you want. Yeah, it's fine. If everything is input correctly, Oro will have a high chance of doing the move with the kick, and a relatively lower chance of doing either nothing, and then possibly doing either a crouch medium kick or a throw, or using the punch, which is an overhead. It's actually relatively important to do this right, or he will end up doing the kick every time. So your action 5 again becomes relatively difficult to pull off. If you need him to jump more, there's some other crazy things you can do with the action 5, but we're far enough into the stream now that I really don't feel like trying to demonstrate them all, and it's fairly easy to understand once you've done it. If you want that information before the bot page is released, all you basically have to do is end at up forward instead of ending at forward in that last quarter circle in action 5. This slows down the match quite a bit, but footsie characters tend to hang out at a range where Oro wouldn't get a lot of chance to use the Onigi anyway. And while I should not jump at him the way I've been doing, he's definitely not going to pose that much of a threat if you know how to fake people out into doing their uppercuts with your jumps. Note that Oro actually has quite good anti-airs, so you shouldn't generally do this. While his skill 2 is a threat quite a lot, he has to be fairly in your head before it actually matters on most footsie style characters, because you're either going to block it or you're going to reach the moment where you can get him. He takes a little while to come out of the move altogether. You'd think this was a good reason to make sure that he almost always does the overhead, but the overhead itself, while very good, isn't necessarily much harder to stop. So, while obviously there is a point system now based around dealing with the move and basically reacting in time, you can get a point every time you touch him after that. The overhead is more so a good way for a player to condition you into not responding to the move than anything else. And because it is so relatively slow and stoppable in other forms, it's not particularly disadvantaged to Oro. Which means technically you have to recognize that he hasn't done an attack and react to that very quickly. Some of it is guesswork, but not enough that you can't just practice it and assume that those occasional times where you must guess, you did fairly alright. He's not likely to do this move too much unless he thinks he has you on the defensive, because it is very interruptible, and once again, footsie characters, they'll just kick him out of it or something. Part of what he's looking for here, in fact, is the idea that you will react too early, because then he can use his hit grab, which reaches really far. It is also a good way for him to just move forward while holding charge, as the input direction he's holding while doing this hop has basically no meaning. That's probably one of the most important things. The bot does not specifically have a lot of it, but we did work some of it in, and you can improve that in any way you like with just change of a variant or making sure that he has this as an option. But it's not likely to come up a lot, and if you learn to challenge the move itself, it's very unlikely to matter. But understand that if you are facing this character, there is a good reason to learn to deal with this. He has charge, he's holding charge, and that benefits him. But he has an advancing move that also poses a threat to you, which he can do all aspects of without releasing the charge at all. Putting the Tengu Stone on top of that just makes life even more interesting. Once that move is active, he's able to keep you at a more respectable spot and to add more hit stun to you, which means you have to spend a lot more time watching for the hop. It is also shifted by the fact that you simply have more things on the screen to pay attention to, and learning to focus in on him while he's doing this can be a little bit hard for some of us. Once again, depending on your input, he won't necessarily always do this move particularly well. He might find himself doing the hopping kick far more often than anything else. Another possibility is that just due to rhythm or inputs, he will lack the capacity to do anything particularly threatening after the hop. And this goes up more and more the more you punish the other kick he's doing, because just how the timings work. But at the end of the day, as you can see, all of these things help with his range, and that means you can still get jumped on, tripped, have to deal with double jump, and so on. Adding the up, forward, into the other Action 5 will help double jumps occasionally, and it also changes the hopping special into something that can, depending on character and how your inputs go, work as an instant air move and actually hit you. If you play a particularly tall character like Alex, for example, it's actually quite likely that you will want to put in that last up forward into Action 5 at the end. The more he jumps, for a character like Alex, the more you have to do work, the more you care about it, and the more options he has for doing quick and confusing things when he's close. As you can see though, it doesn't necessarily get over too much. So even a crouching medium kick will still sometimes check this move. That said, confirming your crouch medium kick can be a little bit more difficult to get yourself to do. Chun is not a character on whom I'd want to do that consistently, but it is a move that is bringing Oro closer, so I could definitely go ahead and do it. Still, getting too jumpy about it on particular characters will make your life quite difficult. But what about characters that want to play more close-up altogether? Or those that do some middle ground between I'm getting close to you and I'm playing footsies. Particularly characters who have no projectile, have good options in other ways, and whose entire goal is to get close enough using footsies to pressure you and hit you more. That puts us into Kami territory. And when you're in Kami territory, you no longer specifically want his V skill to be the Tengu Stone. It's still good, but Kami has a lot of options for dealing with this. Invincible moves of multiple types, and can get around some things altogether through this.
Temple hideout.
So, you're better off
Kami.
when you've decided you're going to learn this matchup,
I'll be on time.
giving him the trigger 1. I can't say that there won't be players out there on the Oro side who will not use Onibi against Kami, but it doesn't gain them as much as they might want to, because Kami gets fairly good pressure off of her knockdowns, and while he is able to uppercut, he doesn't have a lot of really great responses to someone in his face of that type. Again, the prerequisite of this is basically you kinda want to play footsies, but you don't really want to if you don't have to. And that puts you right into the space where he could actually grab you with the V trigger. These characters are also better at dealing with the V skill 1 though. So the reason for changing it to V trigger 1, the V skill 2, so the reason for changing it to V trigger 1 is not actually because you're going to get any points from dealing with that. It's just to increase the threat he poses and to give you experience with the move as a whole. Fortunately, it's slow enough that you shouldn't expect Wake Up from it to do anything to you or for him to even try. And therefore you can also treat the point system here as tacking the throw. Especially if you have a character like this who doesn't have a lot of trouble punishing the uppercut, you could work that in that space instead. This is another demonstration of what happens when bots fight different characters. It changes their rhythm. So you should generally try to tune the bot as best for yourself, for your main character or characters, whatever you think is good. If it looks approximately right based on the amount of footage you've seen so far, go with it. Fortunately, he's not a bot where you're likely to get a whole lot of variance in terms of what you're supposed to be doing, where he's failing to throw at the right time or jumping too little or too much. He tends to do almost all of these things around the same amount because the inputs that spawned those actions are generally consistent. But you immediately see with the rhythm that Orobot ends up using against Kami, there's a lot more use of kick version of the V skill 2, and a lot more empty V skill 2 into low, which also matters. Depending on your action 1, it may of course also be V skill into throw. Kami is actually the one that demonstrates why Oro is strong as a character. Oro tends to pull back hurt boxes quite quickly after completing moves. He's therefore slightly harder to whiff punish than other characters. We were eventually going to try to make him a whiff punish bot, but that's kind of against the purpose. He's hard to whiff punish and therefore you can use it to increase your whiff punish skill, but he's so hard to whiff punish by design, so it's generally not going to be part of your game plan. Feel free to add it to some extreme version of your practice, but he's not necessarily a good bot to work on that with. Nor for hit confirming, because the same sort of thing happens. You hit buttons more so to check Oro than because you are likely to get a good hit out of the hit confirm situation. He doesn't care. He's happy to keep on blocking and it helps him keep charge, so you'd end up spending more time trying to see if you could get Oro to block long enough for you to land a throw, or set up some other thing, if not a full overhead, then something that will give you advantage and still be tricky. Still maybe avoid his crouch medium kick or sweep or similar. If you're playing a Kami style character, you probably don't actually want Oro to have that up input part of the action 5. You just end at the forward, because the more Oro does things like the hop, the more Kami has to think about things. This isn't just because she has aerial options of her own, but simply because it gives him a quick way to get to her and put pressure on an air approach that most players are not going to react to in time in the same way. And since Orobot, like many others, doesn't jump that often at all, the uppercut from most Kami players would already be difficult enough. Similarly, footsie players are used to being able to hit people after they do that without walking. But again, Oro tends to move hurt boxes out of the way fairly quickly. So his slightly goofy stances and movements are in fact true mastery. But if you've trained for long enough against our other bots, there's a decent chance you'll still get at least some of your anti-airs, and it's going to be important because this character is likely to jump on you a lot more than you think people would dare to do in the mid-levels. We have no direct data on how exactly high level Oro will play because we don't have enough people at a high enough level yet. But just looking at current top level players playing Oro, you wouldn't necessarily get the impression a lot of jumping is going to happen, despite him having double jump options. Despite the fact that Kami is basically close enough to Oro in movement, you don't expect that she's going to be getting hit by the instant stomp version of the hopping kick. Not that hopping kick, the full special move version. And therefore it's not necessarily worth your time to try to perfect that at all. Also, him just jumping normally occasionally isn't as good as him using the move. The easy way to make this decision is mostly whether or not your character is able to anti-air with something quick and short consistently or not. If they play footsies and have good anti-airs, then treat it one way, and if they have confusing or difficult anti-airs, you treat it another way. In fact, one such character is easy enough to show off now. Within our group of players, we still have more to go. And can demonstrate this using Rainbow Mika. The stream has gone relatively long for this guidance, but not too much so, and we expect to close it up within about 10 minutes.
Rainbow Mika. Oro.
In this case, we will probably continue to use the V skill 2 and the V trigger 1. Even though Mika is likelier to get the grab on Oro than Oro is to get on Mika, it's kind of helpful to have it because the move's range is so long relative to most other command grabs that it can in fact be used as an in-between. So, a quick change of buttons now. So this is shown at maximum capacity. And what we're looking for here is mostly, again, anti-airs, which are not going to come up all that quickly, but in previous testing, it seemed that Oro moved into the air a little bit more against Mika, partially again because of rhythm. Mika is a fairly footsie heavy grappler. I mean, all grapplers have to play footsies, but Mika is good at aspects of it that the others don't easily match up to, while not being as limited as Alex in the grappling aspect of it. If you wanted to switch to having the V trigger too, it doesn't necessarily help as much in terms of both your training and, I would think, kind of in the matchup. Because while it's relatively easy to pin Mika down using the Tengu Stone, she kinda doesn't care as often. Because as soon as she realizes the stone part has ended, she has an armored move to go through whatever Oro has to do next. This similarly applies to Birdie, for example. Birdie has even more options, and the anti-air game isn't as complicated, but it's the same thing. They can be placed under a lot of pressure, but they're likely to keep blocking, and since you must choose between one and the other, you can't use the threat of the Tengu Stone to give you the command grab. Once again, balance. Fortunately, the command grab is cancelable, which is probably one of the things that matters the most. And that's where the decision to do that comes up. The Tengu Stone will definitely give you quite a lot of damage every time Oro hits. But sometimes people need to be reminded that if someone picks the V trigger 2 against you, they could easily have just guaranteed damage sometimes. You can see that our Mika player is not particularly intimidated by Oro's actual jumps, and that's basically another reason why he often needs to be able to do the hopping kick. It is a movement into the air that will cause the player to react, but almost always hit before it's actually the time when they're ready to do the anti-air. It's not terribly difficult to anti-air if you just have one of those like stand medium punch anti-airs. You can in fact trade with it, sometimes just hit him, but if you don't have one of those, or if for various other reasons in neutral you're less likely to hit it just early on someone's jump, then Oro's more likely to get away with his hop. Basically, how early can you hit your button-based anti-air is the decision to whether or not to try to put that last up forward on action fire. Characters like this also tend to leave themselves open more often, and that would be another reason to default to this V trigger. If you're not familiar, Oro's projectiles are disadvantaged, but barely at all. So there's no point in like practicing against them. If he hits you with a projectile, he didn't just dash up and do it because he had to charge. Or rather, I should not say that because there's so many people who can, and he does have methods for it, but overall, you're not looking for a way to deal with him doing this. You just probably press like a medium and hope for the best. As you can see him happily demonstrating here, the V shift is a part of the bot. It doesn't come up at any really useful times most of the time. But thankfully he doesn't do it often enough to just waste all his V-trigger either. You'll notice it does not actually do as much damage as you'd figure either. But we do have one more relatively special note for characters who have no projectile, play footsies, and don't have good anti-airs. There are not many of these in the game, but fortunately for us we have at least one to use for the demonstration to close out the stream. Karin's capability to anti-air Oro consistently without using any meter is fairly low. And this is eventually going to cause problems in this matchup. Secondarily, as a character who uses footsies in that way, it is often a problem for her if the Tengu Stone is chosen. She's not trying to get as close as Mika is. So we're going to switch some buttons and then switch a V trigger. As we are having a midweek disc guidance, we are also planning to get the Kira Bot's disc guidance out on Friday. He remains with the V skill too because Karin is again a footsies character who benefits from building up a response to the hop, and while she is actually kind of susceptible to the Onibi, she can usually move quickly enough and jump at good enough spacing that you don't actually get a lot out of choosing this against her, unless you expect to get a lot of knockdowns. But she's not terribly susceptible to most of those, so you're much better off in this situation. Lock down with the Tengu Stone. As you can see, he's also just throwable. But again, all of these things rely on the fact that he doesn't actually go for the kick. So there is a very small window in which you build up the skill for it. It's not necessarily all that hard, particularly if the button you need to hit that you want to start your interruption combos with is either a down back move or just throw, which you can do from down back anyway. The basic idea being that you learn to block for just long enough that if it is the kick, then you'll block it, and then hit the button with the timing that if it is not the kick, you'll get it. And that's it. It takes a while to practice, if you aren't used to doing this for other characters like Lara, but it's definitely worth building up, and therefore the points are based around that. Despite the use of the Tengu Stone, there are basically no points associated with Tengu Stone at all, because a good Oro player is in so much control of the Tengu Stone, either to lock you down or to damage you for long periods, that you don't really get a choice in the matter in the first place. The reason we put it here is because being locked down can lead to emotional changes for some people, and adding stress to you in that way will help you get used to having that stress during matches and dealing with it. We really don't want Orobot to jump more than this. So all of this talk we give about anti-airs being difficult or whatever, they're partially difficult because he doesn't need to jump very often and because he simply won't. When we release these bots, you will be able to find them at our website 2-mk.org. it'll be slash Orobot slash Akirabot with the dash in between the name of the character and the bot, as always. And those should both be available Sunday, though there may be some delay to Monday if we have any other issues. Testing of the bots has not generally been a problem, but there's some other stuff we need to do, so it's possible we won't get to it. At least not entirely. If you want to review the inputs without having to constantly check the actual stream, you can find them annotated more clearly on our Twitter _MK_FGC. Basically on either release day or the day right after that, just look in that time frame. While they're called prototypes, if you remember anything I said about the stream and are just looking for how do I input this, I remember all the timing stuff or whatever, then you can get that information there. If you have any questions about the bots, or anything you need to share with us about either strange behaviors they have or super cool behaviors they have, you can contact us again in those Twitter DMs, but probably better to send full information stuff from the contact us page on the website. The exact purpose of these two relatively advanced bots depends a lot on you. Depends a lot on what you play, why you play the way you play, and of course which character you play. So they're more likely to have quite a bit more information on the bot pages to help you out. And possibly it's just stuff that helps with understanding how to fight the character, even if you don't need the bot. Quick primers are always useful. That, however, brings us to basically the end of another Disc Guidance stream. Look out for the next one on Friday. This has been Rillian, 14 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.